Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of a topic that often gets ignored. We're peeling back the curtain on an intersection of U.S. and global policy that often escapes the headlines, the dehumanizing machinery of immigration enforcement systems, and what they say about the value we choose to uphold or ignore. Let's start with the United Kingdom's immigration detainee escorting system, a nightmarish logistical network dissected in Professor Mary Bosworth's searing book, Supply Chain Justice. Bosworth takes us inside a system where people are reduced to commodities, monetized, managed, and moved like packages in a warehouse. The UK government has outsourced humanity itself, delegating the detention, circulation, and deportation of foreign nationals to poorly paid private contractors. These contractors operate within a bureaucratic labyrinth of quotas and financial penalties, where human lives are measured against service-level agreements and key performance indicators. But here's the gut punch. Is this really so different from what we're seeing here in the United States? Our own immigration system, filled with detention centers, private contractors, and a tangled web of executive actions and congressional inaction, operates under the same logic. In tonight's episode, we'll explore how our immigration enforcement system reflects similar failures where humanity is overshadowed by bureaucratic efficiency of enforcement. And joining us is a powerhouse duo to untangle this reality. Professor Jennifer Chacón, author of Legal Phantoms, Executive Action, and Haunting Failures of Immigration Law, and Professor Mary Bosworth herself is joining us. Professor Jennifer Chacón, of course, researches issues that arise at the nexus of immigration law, constitutional law, and criminal law and procedure. Her writings shed light on how legal frameworks on immigration and law enforcement shape individual and collective understandings of racial and ethnic identity, citizenship, civic engagement, and social belonging. Professor Chacón, thank you for being part of the Poco Mic. And also, Professor Mary Bosworth is here, and her extensive work focuses on a similar topic. She has been conducting research on the experiences of staff and incarcerated people in British immigration detention centers and about the processes of deportation. While most of her work focuses on the UK, her research is international and comparative and has included studies of France, Greece, the United States, and Australia. Professors, thank you so much for being on the Political Mic. And I want to start off the conversation by asking this question to you, Professor Bosworth. Your book, Supply Chain Justice, exposes the chilling mechanics of the UK's outsourced immigration system. When you describe the system as a logistics business, what does that reveal about how governments, especially democratic ones, are shifting moral accountability for immigration enforcement? Is this a deliberate abdication of responsibility in your view?
Hi, Mike, and thank you for having me on the show. And hi, Jennifer. Nice to see you as always. So that's a good question, Mike. And I think one of the things that's important to realize about the British system is that all parts of the custodial side of the British immigration enforcement system have always been privatized. So the UK government has, from the very beginning, when they started bringing in border controls and an immigration processing system, they've always turned to the private sector to deliver that service for them. So there are not publicly owned and run immigration detention centres in the UK, and there's not a publicly owned and run deportation centre. It's always been outsourced to the private sector. So is it deliberate? Well, yes, it is, because it's always been like that. Is it deliberately dehumanizing? I mean, I imagine that civil servants would say that it's not. And I also imagine that the people who operate the system might wish to say that it's not as well. I think one of the difficulties about doing research is that you often find yourself coming up with an understanding about what people are doing, which maybe would be something which they themselves would find difficult to do because people are caught up in the processes and the bureaucracies that their jobs demand. But certainly in the British system, this privatization allows the government to hand over the practicalities to the private sector, and it allows them to sort of be somewhat shielded from the consequences of what are the laws that obviously the government has to pass.
And Professor Chacón, under President Trump's first term, and we're of course 11 days away from the initiation of his second term, immigration policies have become increasingly punitive. The zero tolerance policy comes to mind. This, policies coming from the mind of Stephen Miller as key advisor on that particular issue. How does the UK's outsourced detention system mirror or diverge from the policies enacted during the Trump presidency, such as family separations or prolonged detention of asylum seekers?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation about issues that I care about and to have them with people like Professor Bosworth. I also want to acknowledge the co-authors of my book, Legal Phantoms, who are not here today, Stephen Lee and Susan Poutine. And in the book, we don't focus on the immigration detention system specifically, but I do think that what the policies that you referenced, zero tolerance, kind of the shutdown of the southern border for asylum applications during the first Trump administration, are policies that we can expect to see redounding in some ways under the second Trump administration. And in fact, I think were something that really troubled the Biden administration over the course of its 4 years, as they had to come up with new systems to deal with an incredibly backlogged system of asylum at the border, and trying to think about how to rehabilitate an internal refugee resettlement system that had been largely dismantled and defunded under President Trump during COVID closures. So I think we are in for a renaissance and a revitalization of the immigration detention system in the United States. We're probably going to see rising numbers of detainees. We're probably going to see increasing reliance on state and local facilities to assist in the detention of migrants. So I think similarly, and increasingly, and we saw the jump in the stock prices of private companies that engage in detention work. I think we can similarly expect to see greater reliance on private actors in order to sustain the increased demand for detention.
And what are some of the historical or political decisions that allowed for the corporatized supply chain model to become entrenched in British immigration policy?
So the reason I talk about this particular part of the detention system as being a supply chain is that I'm partly talking about that in distinction from the more familiar longer-term immigration detention side. So perhaps one of the things that might be helpful for people watching the podcast or listening to it would be to understand that this new book that I've just published is looking at the initial places of detention where people can end up in if they, for instance, arrive on a small boat in the south coast in the UK seeking asylum, as people have been in increasing numbers coming over from northern France trying to seek asylum in the UK. They include the sites where you might find yourself if you try and fly in on an expired passport, for instance, or a passport that doesn't have enough months left in it to be allowed entry into the UK. There are sites of detention in airports. It also includes sites which they use for people who are coming to the end of their prison sentence and are facing a deportation order, and they need to sort of transfer them from one side of custody, ideally in their system, to the plane. And then finally, it includes sites which are part of the asylum process, so people who are residing in the UK and who are undergoing an asylum process. They've claimed refugee status, and then the state has decided that they will deny them their refugee status, and so they now want to remove them. So they're all very different kinds of places, and they're held there normally very briefly. Those sites of detention are quite different from longer term sites of detention, which the UK also uses, which are the sites which I used to study, where people can be held actually indefinitely. And those other sites are called immigration removal centres in the United Kingdom. And the reason why I'm going into this slightly pedantic academic distinction is that when people write about the longer term detention centres, myself included, we have always emphasised their similarities to prisons, because in Britain, immigration removal centres, where you can be held for as long as the government desires, really, are all either former prisons that have been kind of turned into immigration detention sites, or they are new build establishments which were built to a particular kind of high security prison design. All the people who staff them at the higher levels, they all have come from previous jobs in the prison service. And all of the rules that sort of govern them are also adapted from prison rules. So what criminologists and legal scholars and other academics and also activists have always said is, have always written very critically about those sites as sites of punishment, which are not restrained really by the similar sorts of legal standards that the criminal justice system have to observe. And so when I went into these other places, these short-term places, and when I watched deportation flights, I was sort of expecting them to be similar. I was kind of expecting them to be sites that felt like prisons, that staff would tell me that the people who were in them were criminals, and that they were dangerous, and that's why they were in them, and that's why they were being deported. And I expected that both from my previous research, but also from how the government tends to talk about any form of detention and deportation. They often refer to people as being illegal, for example. But what I found was not that. What I found was actually really amazingly super banal sites, which don't really have any, or not any, but have very little overlap with prisons and punishment, which are much more like any other kind of waiting room, which some of us might have to sit in for some time, with the exception that you get locked in and you can't leave. So they're sites of custody, and they have all of the kind of trappings of custody insofar as it's, you have no freedom of choice, and the people who staff them have certain physical powers as well as legal powers over you, but they're not really clearly sites of prison. So that was one distinction. The other distinction, which is important, I think, is that when we think about custody, prisons, and longer term detention, we generally think about them as places where people are held for long periods of time. And so scholars tend to be interested in them as sites where people live for a long period of time. But these places are specifically designed not to be that. So these places are specifically designed to be places where you're held briefly and then moved somewhere else. And in both of those ways, this sort of absence of a very explicit penal architecture and this different temporal element, it became clear to me that what was really important about them was not just that they allowed the government to sort of stop you and hold you and confine you, but also that they allowed the government, through the private sector, to force you to go somewhere else. And that's where the sort of metaphor of the supply chain, I think, sort of became something that felt very, very natural, because that's also how we use supply chains for products. We have a whole system, Amazon warehouses, where things are transported and then they're held and then they're kind of sorted, and then they might be moved to another one to bring them closer to the point of sale or delivery, or they're put in a van, and those items are then dropped off on your front doorstep and highly likely stolen by someone who's waiting for them. So there are all of these practical similarities between moving people and how we move lots of other things. And once I started thinking about the system in those terms, then I asked a whole series of different kinds of questions about what these places are, what they're for, what justifies them, and what we actually can make of them morally.
There seems to be a anti-immigrant sentiment that's not just prevalent in the United States, but throughout the world. And when we're looking at the recent elections that took place in 2024, I can't help but realize that immigration played one of the center key issues. It was one of the center key issues that motivated voters' decisions and who they ultimately decided to cast their vote for. There was an AP report that said about half of U.S. adults named immigration and border topics in an open-ended question that asked respondents to share up to 5 issues they want the government to work on. And then when you look at the United Kingdom, there seems to be a similar sentiment prevalent in the country. Data showed that British attitudes toward immigration softened between 2015 and 2021, but hardened slightly in 2023. Do you both attribute the recent uptick in opposition to specific political developments or media coverage or economic conditions? What's really behind this anti-immigrant fever?
Shall I start? I don't know if we've lost Mary. I think all of the above. I think it's a combination of factors. I think we saw in real time over the period from 2020 to 24 that there were economic struggles that people were confronting, and that certainly those pocketbook issues, I think, make people look sort of at the wider world and try to figure out why it is that they feel like they're falling behind, why it is that they don't have the, the ability to sort of live the lives that they want to live. So I think that, whenever there are economic problems, and we can look at the history of the United States, whenever the economy feels like it's pinched, then you often see that coupled with a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. So that's kind of historically true, and I think that played out. I do think some of this is about how the stories of immigration are reported and how the media covers the topic. So I think, if we think about what happened during Trump, particularly the end of the Trump term during the COVID crisis, there was a complete shutdown of the asylum system that was actually contrary to U.S. law. So if you look at the statutes and what's required when people come seeking asylum, we were not complying with those obligations or our international obligations. And so I think when, it's easy to shut something down for a short period of time, but it's not necessarily legal to do so. And it causes a great deal of human suffering. So if you sort of traveled to the southern border and saw the conditions that people were experiencing as they waited to process their legal asylum claims in the United States, you could see that a lot of human suffering is a consequence. And so I think when the Biden administration ended COVID closures, they had to deal with a backlogged population of people who had been through a great deal of suffering and a great deal of waiting at that point in time, and then deal with domestic systems that were ill-equipped to sort of handle the new flows. And so that's when we saw busing to major cities and an outcry from some big city mayors about the pressures this was putting on them. And I think that ultimately the administration was able to come to develop systems to deal with both the backlog and also by processing asylum claims no longer sort of was contributing to that kind of backlogged situation. But I think that takes time. And the way that the media was reporting the immigration story neither accounted for the pressures of the backlog and the way that needed to be processed, nor did it tell the story about the effective systems that were being put into place ultimately to process asylum claimants, to resettle people, and to ensure that their claims were processed in accordance with what the U.S. law requires. So I think by the time the story started to catch up, the election cycle was pretty much over. And so I do think there's a lag. And the final thing I'll say, and this I think speaks to Professor Bosworth's point about numbers and logistics. I think whenever the number of people coming to the border is high, this triggers certain sorts of anxieties. And certainly we had seen an increase in people coming, particularly from various countries in South America and Central America, due to conditions in those countries that were pushing people to move and to claim asylum. And when numbers increase, that feeds certain kinds of anxieties. And when that overlaps with economic anxiety, it's particularly potent. And that is something that I think politicians are able to exploit. And they're able to turn focus out and blame out away from economic systems internally to people who are in need. And so it's sort of the perfect storm. And if the media is not careful about how they are talking about these trends, if they're not talking about them as cycles, which they are, if they're not focusing on the push factors and the ways those push factors change over time, which they do, then the story that the public receives is one of an unalleviated group of people who are constantly going to be coming and an inability of the U.S. system to absorb them. And that's a scary story. And so if that's the only story that you're hearing, then it would make sense that you'd be motivated to vote in a way that push back against that story. And the final link, I think, to the story that Professor Bosworth is telling is it also reduces people then to numbers. We begin to think about people in purely numerical terms. There are a lot of people coming. We have to do something about a lot of people. We have to be efficient in the way that we do this. And the focus turns to a focus on efficiency and processing and bureaucratic processes that can move people. And we lose the sight of the fact that they are people with legal rights and claims. And I think this is something that really was very obvious in the way that immigration was discussed throughout the U.S. election cycle.
Can I also just add to that, because I think this issue about how the media and how politicians represent immigration is also it's kind of important, I think, for us to sometimes do a bit of a reality check on that, because, for instance, you can often think of groups of people who are not treated in quite the same way and who are not discussed in quite the same way. So in the UK, the very obvious counter to all of this is how the UK dealt with people who came from Ukraine. So actually the UK let in lots of people from Ukraine, and there was a completely different legal apparatus that was built around them. There was a totally different way that local communities spoke about them. There's been a sort of welcoming, a sense that this is what Britain does, when faced by people who are seeking refuge and who are, fleeing from war and persecution. That's really positive. But it stands in stark contrast to the narratives that were then fed under the previous Conservative government and have unfortunately continued under our because we have a new Labour government, about the people who come over from northern France on the small boats. And there are key differences. One, most of the Ukrainians who came were women. Ukrainians are white. Perhaps you could also argue that Putin is a clearly shared enemy, at least, or maybe. Whereas the people who come over on boats are mainly men, they're mainly young men, they're mainly young men of color. And so, perhaps those are going to be very key distinctions that are much more easily whipped up into some sort of concern. Also, you could argue, if you wanted to be very pedantic about it, that many of the Ukrainians, although certainly not all of them, came under a system that was built for them to apply to and then come, whereas people who come over on boats are not going through a system precisely because there is no system for them to come over through. But I think that, we rather than sort of wringing our hands and saying, oh, it's all just terribly racist, which it feels like it is, we could also say the Ukrainian example shows us that we can do it and that we have done it and that we do it. So let's just try and take the sort of factors that allowed Britain to not be sort of anxious about these quite sizable numbers of people coming, and think about how we might take those sentiments and those processes and the legal structures that were built and now expand them out to include these other populations who are also indeed fleeing persecution, war, and have a right to claim asylum. So I think there are different stories, and part of all of our job is to try and look for the ones which give us a bit of hope and a bit of a way forward. And that's going to be very difficult over your next 4 years, I dare say.
And of course, our neighbors to the north here in the United States, Canada, is also experiencing some of this anti-immigrant fever. There are many who are attributing Justin Trudeau's fate to his recent immigration policy that would loosen immigration restrictions and allow people to become Canadians easier, especially if they have a parent who is a Canadian citizen. So this is a worldwide phenomenon, it seems like, well, as both of you alluded to. But the ethnographic research that supply and chain justice seems to delve into highlights the role of poorly paid, minimally trained staff. How does this dynamic impact not only the detainees but also the workers themselves? Are these frontline employees just as trapped in this system as the people they're tasked to detain and deport?
Yes, I mean the very short answer to that question is yes, they are. I think one of the things that I've tried to do in this book is really pay close attention to the socioeconomic status of the workers, to try and better understand the system, and also to try and, I guess, go in open-hearted to understand what would actually bring somebody to this line of work and keep them in it. Because it's not an easy job. It's not a very pleasant job, and it's not really a job, despite all the politics around immigration. It's not actually really a job that's particularly valued. So it's not like, I mean, in the UK, being a police officer is still seen to be a kind of honourable profession. Working in border enforcement doesn't have the same kind of cultural cachet, and so. As a privatized system, as a system that's been outsourced, it should come as absolutely no surprise to any of us to realize that the salaries in it are low, relatively speaking. They're lower than the equivalent public sector job. So if you could be a police officer in England, you would earn more money than if you were a detention custody officer. They are also, all the work conditions are much worse. So, things like shift patterns, pension entitlement, promotion, job security, they all follow the kind of a template of neoliberalism. So, the way in which this system is set up is that the private company bids for a contract from the government, from the Home Office, as it's called over here, and in that contract they have to promise all sorts of things. But one of the most expensive element of any contract is almost always going to be staff salaries. And so the way you keep your contract as competitive as possible is you keep your salaries as low as possible, and you also keep your staff numbers as low as possible. And that's the logic of the system. And then the effect of that is clearly that you employ people who you don't financially remunerate particularly well, and you don't train particularly well to do a job that's actually, or can have, extremely complicated elements to it. So, not everybody, but some of the people who show up in detention, particularly in Dover on the South Coast, are extremely vulnerable people. And the ones who've come over on boats, I mean, they've done this terrible journey. They will have spent months before in Calais. Many of the women will have experienced sexual assault on their kind of pathway, from their origin country. There's all sorts of vulnerabilities among the population, and the people who they're greeted with are people who don't receive any training in any of the sorts of things that you might need to do to help those people. So even if they wanted to, it's very hard to sort of see what they could do. So it's easy to just level blame at the workers, and I think we shouldn't be shy with doing that to some extent. But I think the system itself is set up in such a way that we also couldn't be surprised that it works in the way that it does, and that many of the staff I spoke to actually had very difficult lives of their own, and lived in parts of the country where there just were no better jobs. Because that's the other thing. I mean, America does this all the time, that you place these, prisons, sites of detention, you place them in socioeconomically deprived, isolated parts of the country where they are one of the very few jobs for people who don't have the resources or the desire to leave that part of the country. And that again has very predictable effects. And so, part of what I get very frustrated with is how we are just set in these patterns of reproducing institutions which have negative effects, as though we don't know that that's what's going to happen, because we absolutely do. We just don't care.
And Professor Chacón, do you see any parallels in the United States, as I alluded to with Professor Bosworth about, the menial pay, the, lack of specialized training, that some of those who are engaged in the day-to-day logistics behind, operating with these detainees and these does that play a role in the United States? I know there's been a lot of criticism from politicians that we need more, immigration judges to speed up the processes by which people could be, either detained and deported or admitted into the United States. There are calls for there to be a smoother transition in terms of how to reunite children with their parents. Does menial pay from those who are serving as officers on the southern border, or a lack of training in terms of how to deal with people in a more personal and humane way, play a role, similarly to how Professor Bosworth alluded to?
I think the parallels to what Professor Bosworth is talking about in the UK context would be found largely in the private detention facilities in the United States. Those are the places where you have people who are usually working for lower pay. They're contractors, so they're not, they don't have sort of government jobs with government style benefits, and that's where we see sort of the call for efficiency resulting in low-paying work, undercompensated work, and lots of pressure on workers who are undertrained. And so, if we compare the U.S. detention system in immigration with the federal prison system, the U.S. immigration detention system is 70% privatized. So that's really where where contractors are working, and where companies are trying to extract value from their workers in the way that Professor Bosworth talked about. When we think about the government employees, those both immigration judges, as you mentioned, and also Border Patrol agents, immigration and customs enforcement officials, those individuals often have relatively good jobs compared to many of the people who are working in the same geographic spaces where they are. So I think one of the reasons that you see widespread support among for example, some Latino voters in South Texas for Republican candidates who promote greater immigration enforcement efforts is because those immigration enforcement jobs on the government side are good jobs. And in a time, good jobs are hard to find when jobs with that sort of career trajectory and compensation are hard to find. And so I think, you know, one question we should be asking ourselves is why are we focusing all our good jobs in spaces of security and enforcement? And are there other sort of productive ways to build out good jobs that make people happy in the places where they are? And I think that was sort of one of the ideas behind green jobs, right? But this is a complicated process to install, to effectuate. So I think that's one place where the parallel diverges a little bit, right? I think we see it in private detention facilities, but I think we see a bit of a different story when it comes to the public workers. And then the immigration judge side, those are also government workers, and they tend to be reasonably well compensated for their training and experience, but they are incredibly overwhelmed in terms of the number of cases that they are being asked to handle. So the backlog in the immigration system is about 3 million cases. The number of cases that judges are supposed to process in any given year are astronomically high, and they don't have a lot of clerks or, you know, an army of clerks or other workers who are helping them process these cases. And this is, I think, one of the puzzles to me of our immigration system. We continue to robustly fund enforcement, immigration and customs enforcement, customs and border protection, and policing efforts around immigration. We don't seem to have much of an appetite for robustly funding the court system that will process all of the cases that are coming into the system. And this creates a sort of broken system that is very easy to point at and very possible to fix, but where politicians don't get a big payoff from fixing the broken system. It's easier to point at the broken and to signpost that this is something that we need to be anxious and nervous about than it is to fund a judicial system that will process the cases that are backlogged.
Professor Chacón, on that note, I want to ask you about the First Step Act. Of course, the First Step Act was passed in 2018. It was a bipartisan criminal justice reform law aimed at reducing mass incarceration and improving prison conditions in the United States. It lowered mandatory minimum sentences for certain nonviolent drug offenses, reduced 3 strikes penalties from life imprisonment to 25 years, applied reduced sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine offenses retroactively. It provided inmates with earned time credits for participating in educational, vocational, and rehabilitation programs. As we're talking about incarceration of human beings, do you see parallels between the profit-driven motives of the U.S. private prison system and the UK's outsourced immigration supply chain? And if so, what lessons might be transferable between the two systems?
So I guess one thing I would say is I think what's interesting is how relatively small the percentage of private prisons are in the United States. If we both compare them to the UK, where I think at least in the immigration detention system, it's absolute. But if we even think sort of in the US context, if we compare the US prison system to the US immigration detention system, we see really, really different trajectories. So most of the prison system in the United States is not privatized, although there are a lot of contracting systems that are working within the space of public prison and providing services within the space of public prison. So I should not be heard to be saying that there's not a lot of private companies that are making money off of the prison system. There are, but it's not just about the privatized prisons. It's also about all of the sorts of services that are provided to prisons, including publicly run prison facilities. So I think in that sense, we do see profit motive around incarceration. And we also see sort of perhaps with the First Step Act, some limit to how much the profit motive is going to drive a pressure for ever continuing increases in incarceration. So I think there has been a growing consensus across both parties in the United States that incarceration rates in the United States are extraordinarily high and very expensive. And I see the First Step Act as some effort to take that recognition, put it into policy, and to at least at the margins begin to chip away at the extremely high incarceration rates that we see in the United States. It's going to take literally decades, though, for those numbers, if they continue on their current trajectory, to come down to the levels that we saw in the 1970s. So we just have seen over the past 50 years a massive spike in the number of people that we incarcerate. And the First Step Act, while it sort of takes a little piece of that, is only a little piece. And it's also important to recognize that federal criminal law is only a small slice of criminal law in the United States, and that much of the incarceration and much of the prison population is really in state prisons and jails. And so that requires state officials to look at their own systems and engage in their own decarceration efforts.
I think it's quite interesting how in both countries the involvement of the private sector in fully running prisons has always been kept relatively low. I mean, the England and Wales, there are fully privately run prisons, and all prisons can be if they start running into problems. So they're kind of monitored in the UK in ways that they're not, as far as I understand it, in the state and federal system in the US, and they're held. Public sector prisons are kind of measured using many of the same sorts of techniques that I describe in the book in terms of key performance indicators and service level agreements. And in those measures, if prisons start to fail, so if, for instance, the suicide rate goes very high, or the presence of drugs is very high, or there is an escape, things like that, then the government can open them up to competition. And so they can say, okay, we think you, the public sector prison service, are not doing a good job, so we're going to invite the private sector in to make a bid to run this prison. And they do that. So they famously have, transferred ownership from the public sector to the private sector in a few instances. And when they build new prisons, the private sector is often particularly interested. So actually the company I study in the book, Mighty Care and Custody, finally won, after many failed attempts, finally won their very first prison contract to run a new, quite large prison for the British system, somewhere in the north, I think, which is being badged as an eco prison because it's all, solar paneled and it's going to have a low carbon footprint and all the rest of it. But even so, the proportion is quite small of places where they're absolutely run just by the private sector. Whereas, it's interesting to sort of think about why is that when there's much less concern about the private sector running immigration. So that's one sort of set of questions which I think is worth us thinking about, not necessarily right now, but just in general terms. Why are we happy for some sites of custody to be run by the private sector and perhaps less at ease with them running other ones? The other point, and maybe this answers that question, is that I think it is a bit of a mistake to imagine that they're really separate, because as Jennifer said, lots of public sector prisons, lots of bits of public sector prisons in the US and in the UK are already outsourced. So, the classic example over here would be food. That used to be something which prisoners made and were, they were taught some kind of cooking skills, and it was a big part of, a prison sentence and what you may or may not get out of it. That's all been privatized. That's handled by the same kinds of companies who do big university student canteens or hospital food or whatever. So there's always, that penetration of the public sector by the private sector is very sustained, to the point that I wonder sometimes how helpful it is to think about them as separate entities. And indeed, in my study, one of the things I do talk about quite a lot is how in that outsourced system, the public sector is still always present. So they're either physically present in a person, so an immigration officer. The most sort of crazy example is on deportation charter flights. there is an immigration officer, somebody who can hear on the plane as you're being taken home, like your last minute appeal. So there's sort of a physical representation of the state, but actually every decision that's ever, all the key decisions, the decision to detain and the decision to deport, they're all still made by the state. The private sector is just a facilitator. So I think in our kind of analysis and critique, we shouldn't be thinking of these two parties as separate. I think they just work hand in glove all the time now, and in the criminal justice system, in the immigration system, and in my case, in the UK, in the public health system as well.
And Professor, on that note, do you see any potential for similar bipartisan legislative efforts in the United Kingdom to dismantle or reform its detention supply chain that may be comparable to something like a First Step Act to address many of the dehumanization issues that we've been discussing so far? I know you alluded to, even the change in government. I mean, for the first time since 2007, I believe the Labour Party is back. And I think that's when Tony Blair left 10 Downing Street back in 2007. Well, the Labour Party is now back, and there's a new government that's in control with Keir Starmer. Is there potential?
I think the Labour government will vote out in 2010. I think we had 14 years of the Conservatives. Is there potential? Well, so one of the very first things that the incoming Prime Minister did, the Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer, was he cancelled what was known as the Rwanda plan. So he cancelled an effort that the Conservative government had poured a lot of money into to try and set up a system where, rather than processing people's asylum claims in the United Kingdom, as they are required to by British law and also by international human rights law, they would actually force them onto planes and send them to Rwanda, where their refugee claims would be processed by the Rwandans. Now, that was a kind of very divisive policy, which the Conservative government were insisting they were going to bring in. And in order to try and facilitate it, they didn't just set up a deportation flight and planes and all the rest of it, but they also created a whole series of sites of secure housing, which weren't detention, but were not necessarily places people could leave while their asylum case was awaiting being put on the plane to go to Rwanda. So one of the first things Starmer did was he abandoned that. He's a former human rights lawyer, and he said, okay, that is a step too far for me. And so that's a good thing. That was I don't know how bipartisan that was. There were bits of the Conservative government who were left, who were also opposed to Rwanda. The Liberal Democrats, we of course have more than two parties. The Liberal Democrats were very opposed to Rwanda, and the Green Party were very opposed to Rwanda. So bipartisan progressive things can happen in border control. However, that was a very extreme case. That was a very extreme case which undid a lot of very serious legal protections. And since then, there hasn't been really, at least not that I can think of, any other particularly progressive changes that the Labour government have made. And instead, what we have at the moment is we have a Labour government with a very strong majority who are repeating many of the same kinds of stories and rhetoric that the Conservative government did before them. They're particularly concerned about people arriving in small boats in Dover. They're particularly concerned about what they refer to as the criminal gangs, who are the people who facilitate those trips over. And so there just isn't much evidence of a willingness for bipartisan progressive change. The parties that do call for it, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, they do call for it. They call for a change, an end of privatization. They call for a reduction in detention. They do call for things, but there are so few of them in Parliament. So I'm not very optimistic. And I think one of the difficulties at the moment is that as we see a hardening and a ratcheting up of the rhetoric coming out of the new Trump administration, there are also a series of far-right governments forming in Europe, or if not in the majority, in very significant minorities, all of whom are also running on very anti-immigrant platforms. It's hard to see how this ends. And I think one of the parts of it that I've never really understood is why it's so hard for politicians to propose alternatives. I honestly have never quite understood why they can't see the shortcomings of pursuing ever hardening rhetoric about border control, because on the most fundamental level, it doesn't even work. So you just pour an infinite amount of money into something that doesn't work, and has all of these terrible effects, not just on the people who are stopped and detained and deported, of course, most of all on them, their friends, their families, local communities, but also on the wider population. So yeah, I'm not the right person to ask for something positive. Maybe Jennifer has got has got something up her sleeve.
Well, Professor Bosworth, you argue that the UK system normalizes exclusion through administrative targets and performance indicators. And Professor Chacón, in the United States, similar metrics exist in form of deportation quotas, as we were alluding to earlier in the conversation, detention center contracts, etc. What does this focus on metrics, in both of your opinions, reveal about how governments define success in immigration enforcement, and how might we redefine it to center it on humanity?
Do you want to have a go, Jennifer?
I think that's a great question. I do think that this in some ways ties to the point I made earlier, that much of the rhetoric around immigration really focuses on numbers, and focuses on concern about numbers. And so when we see government officials talking about what success looks like in the immigration system, they're not talking about, how many asylum claims were successfully attained, right? They're talking about how many people were apprehended at the border, how many people were removed, and then critical removal numbers within that. So I think you're right. In some ways, that if that is the focus, then the numbers going up is the goal. And if that's the only goal or the primary goal, and that very much I think is, then that definitely puts a devaluation on investing in other elements of the system, refugee resettlement, fair adjudication of claims, increasing pathways to legal status for people who have been longtime residents, right? There are lots of other things we could do that would be success. And we're not talking about those success stories. We're also, I think, really minimizing the massive success story that is immigration, particularly in the US case. If we think about sort of how the economy is built and how the culture has been built in the United States, it is very much a success story of immigration. And that sort of refrain, which I think we've seen at various moments in US history as a clarion call for fair and open immigration approaches, is something that really is very muted right now. So it is only concern and it is only fear. And I think one of the interesting moments that we've just witnessed was the sort of dispute or fallout among Republicans over H-1B visas, right? Which I think sort of exposes the dichotomy between the focus on keeping everybody out and emphasizing numbers about how we get people out versus a story that focuses on how you encourage people to come and how you ensure that their time when they're here is actually a time in which their legal rights are respected and where their humanity is respected. So maybe this turn away from numbers is an important pivot and one that hopefully, Mike, you can you can encourage people to pursue because it does seem like we're in a sort of damaging loop.
I also think the thing about numbers, I mean, I think there's a sort of banal answer to this, which is that if you have a system, you have to kind of account for it. And that I mean, I talk about it in the book where I sort of say that some of the people who are the busiest people in the immigration detainee escorting system are the people whose job is to count things, to count how many people are coming in and out and how long it takes to get from the detention center to the airport and what proportion of flights actually take off. And there's a whole lot of fairly simple data gathering that goes on. And that's partly because it's sort of justifying the job. It's partly because it's monetized. So you have to, different sorts of things incur fines or attract additional payments. It does also, I think, give a sort of gloss of control that, the state, when faced with a population who are, some of whom are undocumented and they're not quite sure where they are, well, they can at least give you these numbers and tell you this sort of piece of information. Because of course, a lot of the numbers, there are a lot of competing numbers and they're not always very accurate. And so I think sort of counting and accounting fulfills a lot of different tasks. Some of them are political, some of them are just economic. But I think you're right that one of the ultimate effects is that thinking about immigration and immigration control in those sorts of numerical terms is highly dehumanizing. And so part of, I think, what the sort of work that I do tries to do is it does try and rehumanize people by explaining the system and what it's like to work in it. And I mean, in the past, less so in this book for fairly obvious reasons, but in the past I've always spoken a lot to people who are incarcerated about their experiences of incarceration. And I think that is something which is worth doing and worth remembering that it's important to do. And I think when, again, we can think of specific groups of people who've migrated into our countries or who've been, people who've sought asylum, where we don't think about them so much in numbers. Like the Ukrainian population, I'm not sure we have, I mean, the numbers exist, but that's not how they're spoken about. They're spoken about as women, women with children who are fleeing, who are here, we're giving them support. And so we hear stories about their lives, not about their quantity.
And of course, as we're about 11 days from the initiation of the second Trump term, I can't help but think about the grassroots opposition in the United States to some of the Trump administration's immigration policies. How has civil society in the UK responded to its immigration detention system? I know we've been discussing a lot of change from the top down, but is there potential from the bottom up to influence a trajectory shift as it pertains to how we address this problem, how human beings are being treated in these detention centers? What role do you see for grassroots activism in challenging these structures globally?
So I think this is a sector where there is a lot of amazing grassroots activism, and I think, so one of the organizations that Jennifer and I are both involved with is a group called Border Criminologies, who are based here in Oxford, but are an international research network. And we include in the network lots of academics, but also policy makers and activists, and some people with lived experience of border control. And through Border Criminologies, one of the things that I'm always very heartened about is learning about groups that are engaged all over the world in offering, psychosocial support to people, to migrants and asylum seekers who offer legal advocacy work, often with no pay. And of course, individual actions that refugees and migrants take for themselves, are also part of that. So I mean, some of these groups are very formal. So in the British system, we have an interesting arrangement here where all long-term sites of detention have what are called visitor groups attached to them, where volunteers go in however often they're asked to go and meet with people who are detained, just to offer them a kind of, companionship, just to go in and see how they are and talk to them, and so they don't feel like they're completely alone. And some of those groups then are more legally active. So some of them, there's one in particular called Detention Action, who've actually brought legal cases against the government over certain conditions in detention. So there are a lot of organizations, and there are a lot of, particularly younger people. Both of us are teachers, so we get, all these young undergraduates and postgraduates who do fantastic things. So I'm not, I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic because I've just done this long and debilitating study, but I think it's important not to be. And I think there is a lot of activism and there's lots of pushback. And I don't think any government can do what they want all the time. I think they are challenged. The difficulty is that it's hard work. It's hard work, and it's not sort of sufficiently supported, often with either time or money, and there's lots of firefighting, and that's something which I think is particularly the case in the US and is going to be very hard.
And of course, as we're wrapping up the discussion, the idea of transforming human beings into monetized, measurable units is haunting. Was there a moment in the course of the research from either of you professors where there was a specific incident or specific experience that you learned about or witnessed firsthand that just conveyed to you just how inhumane folks were being treated in the process of, being detained?
I think for me, the sites that were very, very difficult were the ones in Dover. So there are a whole number of them, and they're places where people come in on these. They've travelled across the Channel, so between the UK and France, on these little rubber boats, these dinghies, and they come in and they're wet, and they're often wet with fuel. So there's a kind of smell of fuel everywhere. And when you go into these sites, quite a few of them, one of the first things you see is these big blue plastic bags, which are full of their clothes, their wet clothes, and they all have a tag around them. And there's always too many of these bags because there are too many people and there's never enough space. So they just leave them outside. And what I learned was that the tag around the bag is then transferred onto a tag which is put around the person's wrist. And there's a kind of association between them and what are essentially trash bags, really full of their trash, which were their clothes. So that was very haunting, just the kind of visual imagery of that and the scale of it. The other part of the project, also in the same part of the world, was when I went into a detention site that's purely designed to hold unaccompanied children. So when the boats arrive and they sort through the people on them, and they find that there are children on them who've travelled without their parents. And there were two things about that. One was I was really shocked by how quiet it was, because when you go into most sites of custody, whether it's a prison or a detention centre, they're really noisy. People like make a lot of noise when they're locked up in places to sort of, I guess, reaffirm that they exist. But this site was just dead quiet. And then the only sound I heard was, I suddenly heard a baby crying. And in the UK, we officially don't detain children. So we don't detain unaccompanied. We're not meant to detain them. They're only there briefly, but we certainly aren't meant to detain babies. And I suddenly realized there was a mother who'd come over on a boat carrying like a very young baby. And so there was silence punctuated by this baby crying. And that, I have to say, I just suddenly felt fairly overcome, because what kind of system do we have if we respond to a desperate person by locking them up with their baby? That felt very wrong.
And Professor Chacón, have you had experience in the course of your research as you were co-authoring Legal Pantham's Executive Action and Haunting Failures of Immigration Law, where there was something that you just wish if more people saw this, there would be more of a galvanizing effort nationwide or even worldwide to demand that there be some kind of change in the way that folks are being treated in these detention centers?
So in Legal Phantoms, we were not focused on detainees or people who are arriving at the border. So in some ways, the research looked very different. We were having conversations with people who were longtime residents of the United States, many of whom lacked legal status, and then with activists and organizers who were working with around these questions of immigration law and policy. And we also talked to government officials who had worked on programs like the Deferred Action Program. And so that obviously is a very different slice of life. But what I will say is that one of the things that was really very, very compelling was talking to so many people who have lived here for decades, literally decades, who want nothing more than to be able to regularize their immigration status. It is something they very much desire. And there is nothing in the legal system that allows them to do that. And so these are people who have children and grandchildren in the United States. These are people who have worked in jobs for decades in the United States. And there is no path for them. And I think, one of the really revealing things is talking to how people make sense of that, how they live with that. And I think it is somewhat shocking that we are so comfortable living with that reality, the reality of, an estimated 11 million people who have been in the United States, most of them for more than 5 years, many of them for more than 10. And instead of sort of thinking about, well, what do we do to allow for pathways for regularization, we are instead actually just ignoring this population and turning our attention to more and more extreme mechanisms to close the border. And so I think, one of the things that I remember in my work is just talking to people who cleaned houses and were bitten by one woman who cleaned a house and was bitten by a dog and had no access to healthcare and didn't want to pursue any legal action and because of her own legal status. We had multiple conversations with people who had encounters where they were in a car accident and then they were afraid to report. They were hit by another vehicle, but they were afraid to report being hit by the vehicle to the police. We had multiple incidents where people's cars were towed away, and they were paying fines and fees to get these cars out of being towed away because this was at a time when they couldn't have a driver's license, so they were driving and they'd be stopped and they'd be pulled over, and then they'd be told they couldn't drive away without their license, and their car would be impounded. They paid thousands of dollars to get their car out of impoundment. And these are longtime residents who have been living here for years, working here for years. And so hearing these stories of frustration, their sort of inability to find pathways to regularize their status, and the sort of collateral consequences of also not being able to sort of enjoy the benefits of being a recognized and a legally recognized member of their community. Those were really tough stories to hear again and again, and tough stories to hear and to recognize that there are easy legislative solutions for this problem, but that we're not really even talking about that at this point in time.
Well, this has been a very enlightening discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed discussing this topic with two brilliant minds, Professor Mary Bosworth, Professor of Criminology, and the founder and co-director of the research network and website Border Criminologies at the University of Oxford. Thank you, Professor. And your book, Supply Chain Justice, of course, sheds light on a system that few fully understand, yet many are impacted by, a system that, as you demonstrate, profoundly reshapes human lives under the guise of bureaucracy. Thank you so much for what you brought to the political mic. And of course, Professor Jennifer Chacón, author of the book, Legal Panthems, Executive Action, and the Haunting Failures of Immigration Law. The invaluable gems that you were able to share, just lifted this conversation to another level. And I'm so grateful to both of you. Wonderful scholarship from both of you. And I really do just want to thank you for the work that you've both done to shed light on this particular topic and make it plain for people who are not well versed in this particular policy. Thank you so much for what you brought again. That was going to conclude this episode of the Political Mic Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mic Podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMic, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.